Alright guys, to begin today we're going to be talking about the brain as an organ of the central nervous system. And the first part we're going to be talking about today is the cerebrum. Um, the cerebrum is the outer part of the brain that you guys can basically see from pictures of the surface of it. In this particular view right here, you're looking at the lateral view from the left. You're looking at the anterior part and posterior part of the brain. And the cerebrum is mainly comprised of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And for the cerebrum, we'll be talking a little bit more in depth about it later on during the presentation. The next part I want to talk to you guys about is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is this structure here, and it's located basically inferior to the occipital lobe and the cerebrum, which are all located in this area. This is a cross-section view of the brain from the left side. And looking at the cerebellum here, it's located, like I said, inferior to the cerebrum and the occipital lobe, and it's located posterior to the brainstem, which is located right here. This organ is mainly involved in interpreting the sensory information and the information that comes from the inner ear and the proprioception receptors. It interprets it and it uses it to calibrate the body's movements and to smoothen out the coordination of the body movements in order to keep good balance and maintain equilibrium. And it also helps with learning new motor skills as well. The next structure that I want to talk to you guys about is the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is surrounded mainly by the entire cerebrum. The diencephalon is the structure you guys see here in green, and it's mostly made up of gray matter. It's made up of three different glands, and the first one is called the thalamus. So it's the larger one that you guys see right here, and the thalamus is basically the relaying center of information, of sensory and motor information, and it regulates sleep, consciousness, and alertness. And the next part we'll be talking about here is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and with the release of certain hormones and the secretion of certain hormones throughout the body, it can regulate things such as metabolism, stress management, water content of the body, blood pressure, and things like that. And the last part of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. So the epithalamus' main job is to regulate the secretion of melatonin. Melatonin is the chemical that helps us sleep, basically, and this release of melatonin happens in the dark. So the body uses it as an aid to sleep, and it's basically what controls the body's ability to fall to sleep, basically. And the last part of the brain that we'll be talking about today is going to be the brainstem. The brainstem is comprised of three different sections as well, and the first one is called the midbrain. What we'll be talking about here is this blue structure that you guys see to the side, and the midbrain basically is the connection of the brainstem to the thalamus and basically the rest of the cerebrum. And the posterior aspect of it contains the corpora quadrigemma, which is around here. And this is comprised of two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi. The two superior colliculi affect the eyes and the eye's ability to follow movement, just like a kid learns to have the ability to follow a moving baseball or something like that. And the two inferior colliculi affect the ears. So it's actually also enables the body to be able to follow a sound in space. The second part of the brainstem that we'll be talking about is the pons. The pons is a structure that connects the brainstem to the cerebrum. So you guys can see the connection between the rest of the brainstem here and the cerebrum, which is located in superiorly. And the last part of the brainstem that we'll be talking about today is the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is the most inferior part of the brainstem, and it's basically where the crossover of information happens between the information coming from the nervous system, from the peripheral nervous system, and the spinal cord, and entering the brain and through the brainstem and basically branching out to the rest of the brain structures and the cerebrum. Alright guys, next we'll be talking about the distribution of gray and white matter in the brain. So to depict this, I have a drawing here of a brain, that being the anterior aspect and this being the posterior aspect. And what we're looking at here, this line across it, is basically just the exact location of the cross section that you're looking at here on the right. And this is a diagram of the distribution in between the gray matter and the white matter in the brain. So looking at this cross section, you are looking at the blue areas as the gray matter, and basically in the gray matter what you're looking at is the cerebral cortex, which is the surface of the cerebrum. The cell body, the cerebral cortex, or the gray matter, is basically composed of cell bodies of neurons that have dendrites and some short unmyelinated axons. there are no myelinated axons in the gray matter, and it's basically just groups of cells that are forming gray matter from nuclei, not from ganglia like you see in the peripheral nervous system. And here in the white, in the yellow areas covered here in the diagram, you guys see the white matter. So white matter is composed of all myelinated axons, and it contains 3 different kinds of fibers in the brain. So the first one is the association fibers. Association fibers are basically fibers that connect structures such as the diencephalon and cerebellum to other parts of the cerebrum. To other parts of the brain, or one hemisphere or the other. And the second kind of fiber that we're looking at is the projection fibers. Projection fibers basically link other gray areas of gray matter in the brain to structures that are not the cerebrum. And these structures can be things as like the brainstem, for example, the pons in the midbrain, and areas like that. And the third kind of fiber that we're looking at is the commissural fibers. And these fibers are basically the link in between the left and the right hemisphere. They call the structure that's called the corpus callosum. And this is basically the biggest white matter structure in the brain. It is the one that separates the left and the right hemisphere, but it's also the connection in between the 2 hemispheres in the brain. And this basically depicts the distribution of the white and gray matter contained in the brain. Alright guys, so next we're going to be looking at the cerebrum a little bit more in depth, and we're going to talk about the 2 hemispheres in the cerebrum. So we're going to start with the right hemisphere, which basically deals mainly with information that has to do with logic, such as decision making and analyzing numbers, signs, things like that. The left hemisphere is more involved with emotions such as love, freedom, anxiety, happiness, things like that. And also another way that we can pick apart the cerebrum is by looking at it lobe by lobe. The cerebrum contains or is made up of 5 different lobes. The first one we're going to be talking about is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is located in the most anterior part of the brain, and the posterior boundary is the central sulcus. So what the frontal lobe does, it basically makes up a person's personality and way of being. It affects the way that they think. It dictates the way that they make decisions. It also affects their memory and their emotions. And the parietal lobe, which is the next one we're talking about, the one highlighted here in blue, the anterior boundary for this lobe is actually as well the central sulcus, and the posterior boundary is the occipital-temporal lobe, which is the occipital-temporal lobe, which is this entire section here. And the inferior boundary is the lateral sulcus, which is basically right here. So this lobe specifically creates a person's sense of awareness and conscious awareness. It also deals with somatic senses and understanding speech. And this is basically the area where sensory input comes to the brain, so it could be processed in order to affect, like I said, consciousness, awareness, and somatic senses. The next lobe that we're going to be talking about here is located inferiorly to the frontal and parietal lobe, and it's called the temporal lobe. This lobe mainly deals with things such as hearing, smell, facial recognition, which is being able to recognize somebody's face after seeing it once, or object recognition, which is basically being able to remember what an object is from having seen it before. The posterior boundary, like I said, for this temporal lobe is the occipital lobe, which is right over here, and the superior boundary is the parietal and frontal lobe, which you see right here to the sides. The next lobe we're going to be talking about, you actually cannot see in this diagram because it is interior in the brain. It's basically located to more toward the middle of the brain and where the brainstem is located, and it's called the insular lobe. That lobe specifically deals with information that dictates taste, and it deals with the arrival of visceral sensations to the brain. And last but not least, we're going to be looking at the occipital lobe here. So the occipital lobe mainly deals with sight, and it's located to the most posterior aspect of the brain. It is the structure that's located to the furthest, basically furthest back of the head, to the posterior most aspect of the brain. And the anterior boundaries for it are the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. So another 2 different pieces that we gotta talk about here is going to be